Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Meenakshi Datta, Tezpur University. Today we are going to look at the module titled Space Imagery in Science Fiction. This module has been written by Parag Kumar Deka. In this module, we will be looking at an introduction to the genre of science fiction and its relationship with cultural studies. Introduction. In science fiction, space not only refers to cultural spaces like cities and architecture produced by human activities, but also to geographies of aligned planets and cultural spaces of aligned creators. Moreover, the term science fiction itself covers narratives in a number of medias, including books, movies, comic strips, graphic novels, to name a few. Therefore, representation of space and the use of space imagery in science fiction also diversely proliferate according to the medium and themes. This has become particularly true in the case of the visual media, where cultural stresses and spatial imagery is present in almost all the frames and panels. In general perception, science fiction seems to be more about time than about space, as by definition it deals with stories about how people and societies are affected by imagery scientific developments in the future. However, if we consider the above definition carefully, it becomes clear that what is more important is a science fiction story is the way in which the imagery scientific and technological developments have impacted the people and the societies of that particular time. In any given society, materiality, technological impact always takes a spatial dimension, which is observable in newer forms of architectures, conveyance, and altered city space, among other things. The same is true of science fiction, depending on what kind of futuristic or alternative society they depict, and the space imageries or spatial organizations in science fiction works too very widely. Despite the imagery and often literally aligned nature of this landscape, they invariably reflect the spatial arrangements in real human societies. To illustrate this point, we can briefly talk about James Cameron's science fiction movie Avatar. The story of the movie, set in the mid-22nd century, takes place in Pandora, an imaginary planet with its own rich and diverse ecosystem. The movie portrays the conflict between the Na'vi, the indigenous people of Pandora, and the colonizing human beings. The pentagonal perimeter's fence that encloses the large human complex on Pandora is called the Hell's Gate, and the screenplay of the film describes it as a cluster of squared concrete and steel structures surrounded by chain link fence 10 meters high, topped with razor wire. The Hell's Gate separates the human complex from the reset of the planet and its various life forms and indigenous population. Later, we see that this spatial separation is symptomatic of the mental distancing of the colonizing human beings from the inhabitants of the Pandora. For instance, at one point in the film, Colonel Miles Queritz, the head security officer of the human habitation, is seen telling a group of new arrivals on the Pandora, "Out beyond that fence, every living thing that crawls, files, or squats in the mud wants to kill you and eat your eyes for jazzups." Another character describes the native tribe of hominoids as savages with whom the humans are on the brink of war. After a few scenes, when a team of human researchers go into the Pandora's rainforest beyond the Hell's Gate, the screenplay describes Jack, the protagonist's movements of hyper-alert, looking around like a tourist in hell. This spatial separation prefigures their actual persecution and massacre of the Na'vi people later in the film. This example demonstrates how spatial organization in science fiction is also very much political in nature, which is reflected in its use of space imageries. As we shall see in our subsequent discussion, the nature of spatial imagery in science fiction greatly varies according to the political and ideological nature of the world they depict. These worlds, despite their great variations, can be broadly divided into two categories: utopia fiction and dystopia fiction. The word utopia, which loosely means an imagined places or state of things in which everything is perfect, was first used by Thomas More in his book titled Utopia. Darko Suvin says that utopia literature is closely related to science fiction as kindred genre, and according to him, some general characteristics of utopias are isolated location as paranomic sweep to its description, a formal system, and dramatic strategies conflicting with the reader's presumption of normality. In his influential essay titled Three Faces of Utopianism Revisited, the prominent American critic and science fiction and utopia studies theorist Lyman Tower Sargent defined utopia as non-existent society described in considerable detail and located in time and space. As both these definitions demonstrate, though imaginary utopias have a physical dimension, including a clearly defined physical territory, geographically, utopias are either located in an imagined location at the reader's present time or in a real location but in a different time from that of the readers or the writers, and in some cases even in other planets. Thomas More, for instance, located his utopia in an indefinite location in the New World, whose geography is described in the book 2 of Utopia in clear detail. Moore's narrator goes on to tell the reader a title more about the towns which are built on the same plan, and so far as the sites will allow, they all look exactly alike. The town of Aircastle that the narrator describes as a prototype of Utopia town is surrounded by a thick high wall, have the following architectural and spatial characteristics. I quote, "The streets are well designed both for traffic and for protection against wind. The buildings are far from unimpressive, for they take the form of terraces facing one another and running the whole length of the street. The fronts of the houses are separated by a 20-foot carriageway. Behind them is a large garden, also as long as the street itself, and completely enclosed by the backs of other streets. Each house has a front door leading into the street and a back door into the garden. In both cases, there are double swing doors which open at a touch and close automatically behind you, so anyone can go and out, for there is no such thing as private property." Thus, the elimination private property is More's utopia is reflected in the elimination of private spaces, and the thick high wall surrounding Aircastle gives in the identity of a well-defined political space, as well as evokes a history of invasion, as the island was conquered by one Utopos, who renamed it from previous Sanclustia to present Utopia. However, the slave population of the Utopia, which is comprised of criminals from foreign countries and native convicts, is assigned a different position in the utopian society. Although More's Utopia was not a work of science fiction, its impact on the adventure and science fiction writers of the succeeding centuries was tremendous. It also laid down some of the basic principles for future utopias. As Edward James pointed out about utopia writing in general, I quote, "Whether the utopia was Catholic, Protestant, or socialist, however, its distinguishing characteristics were remarkably similar. Communal activities within small village-style communities were crucial. Most utopias eliminated money and private property, thus at one stroke removing greed, theft, jealousy." Unquote. Before the turn of the 20th century, utopia fiction had become a very popular genre in itself. In the last few decades of the 19th century, leading up to the First World War, there was over 200 utopias published, making this period the golden age of utopias. One of the most celebrated works of this period was the American writer Edward Bellamy's utopia science fiction novel Looking Backward, where the narrator wakes up to find himself in the year 2000 in his apartment in Boston. In Bellamy's novel, by the year 2000, America has become a socialist state. Like most of the socialist utopias, the public spaces in the Boston of Bellamy's novel too are constituted of miles of broad street shaded by trees and lined with fine buildings. Every quarter contained large open squares filled with trees, public buildings of a colossal size and an architectural grandeur unparalleled. In the narrator's day, that is in the 1880s, could be seen everywhere. The economy was state uncontrolled and capitalist competition was totally abolished. However, despite Bellamy's Boston apparently being a fiercely socialist country where the washing is all done at public laundries and cooking at public kitchens, the distinction between the public and the private sphere remains very distinct. To modern readers, it presents a totally opposite picture of the contemporary community, kitchens and public eateries. In this respect, Bellamy's representation of spatial organization in his utopia seems to have been governed to a great degree by his late 19th century Puritan sensibilities rather than the narrative logic of his fictional universe. However, most of these utopias did not challenge the conventional patriarchal structure of the society and gendered structuring of spaces. These structures and notions were challenged by a number of science fiction utopia written by women writers, which began to appear almost simultaneously with the other conventional utopias. Below, we'll look at a few such feminist utopias and another form of utopia called ecological utopia or shortly ecotopia. Feminist utopias and ecotopias. Though hardly acknowledged within the academia until very recently, feminist utopias have played a significant role in the history of science fiction. Critics have pointed that the lineage of feminist science fiction can be traced back as early as to the 17th century, or to be precise, to Margaret Cavendish's novel The Blazing World, which portrays a separate world accessible through the North Pole, where scientific inquiry is compared to the practices of the contemporary England. However, it is in only onward the last decades of the 19th century that feminist science fiction came to full flourishing. Here we must distinguish between works of science fiction written by women authors such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and science fiction with feminist sensibilities, whereas the former type of science fiction does not necessarily concern itself with the woman's question. The latter invariably deals with issues of gender roles and relations in a real or imagined society. Feminist science fiction can either be utopia or dystopia. Whereas feminist utopia often presents a society where complete gender equality has been achieved between the sexes, or present a single-sex society without any men. Feminist dystopia portrays societies where gender inequality has been pushed to the extreme and the women are put under various oppressions and exploitations. Both these types of science fiction serve to highlight the oppressive systems of the real world, which is also reflected in their use of distinctive space imagery. The space imageries of feminist utopias not only serve to underline the oppressive social systems, as already mentioned, but also to radically undermine them. The early 20th century Bengali writer activist Ruqayya Shakhawat Hussein's feminist science fiction story Sultana's Dream, which was published in the Indian ladies magazine Madras 1905 in English, is one such example. In this dream narrative, the narrator Sultana falls asleep and finds herself in a country called Ladyland, where gender roles have been reversed and so has the spatial organization of the society. In Ladyland, for instance, it is the women who shut the man indoors, just as the women are kept in the janana in the narrator's contemporary patriarchal world. In that utopian society, men have become accustomed to the parda system and have ceased to grumble at their seclusion. As a result of this, the public space in Ladyland is used exclusively by the women. This inversion of gendered space is made more explicit by contrasting it with the structuring of space in the contemporary Indian society, where the man is lord and master, and has taken to himself as powers and privileges and shut up the woman in the janana. Not only that, the story also draws attention to the gendered division of public and private spaces, where the former is a separate sphere of political and commercial activities and the latter is a place of knitting and needlework. Similar situations are observable in Mary E. Bradley Land's Mizora Prophecy and Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Harland. But unlike the invested gender spaces of Sultana's dream, both Mizora and Harland are all-female societies, from where the men have completely disappeared a long time ago. Whereas Mary Bradley's narrator describes Mizora as a city of surpassing beauty and grandeur, with glowing orchids and verdant landscapes, Gilman's narrator describes the Harland as a land in a state of perfect cultivation, where even the forests looked as if they were cared for, a land that looked like an enormous park, only it was even more evidently an enormous garden. Much like all other utopias, both Mizora and Harland too have clean, wide roads, beautiful architecture, and the sense of an ordered beauty everywhere. However, all these various spaces in these two lands are used exclusively by women, a narrative move that radically challenged the spatial organization of the author's contemporary societies. In the land of Mizora, for example, the narrator notices a universal practice of outdoor exercising, the aim seeming to be to develop greatest capacity of lung or muscle, which was quite a radical idea in the context of 1880s America. Since in Mizora there is no gendering division of social space due to the absence of man, the female narrator can wander about the magnificent building. Similarly, when some Harlands ask the three American male visitors, which also include the narrator, about the nature of their men folks' works, they are told that in their American society the men do not do everything and they do not allow their women to work. Women work. Women are loved, idolized, honored, kept in the home, emphasis added to care for the children. At this, the Harlands expresses their genuine surprise and asks confusedly what they mean by the home. It is noteworthy how most utopias, whether feminist or otherwise, often use space imageries that are a hybrid between well-groomed natural landscapes and highly sophisticated modern architecture. Such well-ordered spaces are often meant to stand for the neatly structured and highly evolved social, political, and economic institutions of these utopias, and the hybridization of the natural and the technological stand for a perfect balance between the two. However, in Ernest Callenbach's ecological utopia called Ecotopia, the notebooks and reports of William Weston, the space is arranged according to completely different principles. Set in 1999, Callenbach's Ecotopia is a political space with clearly defined and closed off international borders and consists of Washington, Oregon, and North California states that broke away from the United States of America and formed this new country. The reigning ideology of Ecotopia is ecological balance and survival. Accordingly, the space imagery in this novel greatly differs from other utopias discussed so far. The space imagery of Ecotopia in every respect reflects the eco-socialist policy of the Ecotopian government, where ecological balance and sustainability are given precedence over all other considerations. Because of the same reason, in Ecotopia, private ownership has been abolished and all the spaces and means of production are owned by the state. Due to this emphasis on sustainability and eco-friendly activities in Ecotopia, we can see a different type of space imagery and a completely different mode of production of space. The reverse engineering of urban space can be seen everywhere in Ecotopia. The narrator William Weston, who is an American reporter, noticed how part of the former suburban residential area has already been turned into altering woods and grassland. The signs of a once busy civilization, streets, cars, service stations, supermarkets have been entirely obliterated as if they never existed. This eco-socialism is also reflected in the government confiscation of exclusive estates and turning them into public fishing communes, schools, hospitals and other public and ecological institutes, and operating up to lakes that have formerly been enclosed in fence-guarded private developments. Impact of ecotopian national policies is also evident in the arrangement of private spaces as well. The narrator notices that Ecotopia housing apartments are much larger than their American counterparts and easily accountable communal living groups. It is noteworthy that the Ecotopian project of the urbanizing social spaces is meant to open up the geographical spaces to more and more people, and even the newly created wild spaces such as grassland and woodlands see a controlled amount of human activity. This means that despite this process of reverse engineering of social spaces, they still remain cultural spaces where various communal activities take place. Such inclusiveness of utopia spaces, however, is in stark contrast to the dystopia societies or even to real social life. This will become clearer when we compare the utopia space imagery with the space imagery used in dystopia science fiction. Dystopia spaces. In dystopian space science fiction, many of utopia features go a complete reversal, something that is clearly discernible in its use of space imageries. By definition, a dystopia is, I quote, "Sargent, a non-existent society described in considerable detail and normally located in time and space, that the author intended a contemporaneous reader to view a considerably worse than the society in which the reader lived." Unquote. Dystopia science fiction as genre began to emerge towards the end of the 19th century, which coincided with the unprecedented rise of industrialization and capitalism in England that had resulted in overpopulation and deepening of class divisions along economic lines. Whereas utopia fiction has always been characterized by communal activities and blurring of the boundaries between the private and public spaces, the dystopia fiction we see such distinction getting more and more consolidated. For instance, in the post-utopia world of H.G. Wells' novel The Time Machine, private space has been completely abolished and people dine and live together in great dining halls and sleeping apartments. However, this arrangement is only superficial, as the time traveler soon finds out. Another important aspect of the depiction of this future society in The Time Machine is the narrator's observation about the relation between power and spatiality. The time traveler conjectures how, after forcing the laborers to live in underground habitats, they can be easily made to pay a very large amount of rent for the ventilation of their caverns by the upper worlders who had an enormous spatial advantage over them. This power emerged from the fact that the upper worlders could easily starve or suffocate the lower worlders by blocking their food, air and light. The depiction of a bleak future society with its exacerbated class division makes The Time Machine one of the earlier modern dystopia, although at first glance the world of the Eloi seems to be a well-achieved utopia devoid of any suffering. Such spatial division and spatial control is one of the primary characters of most of the dystopia narratives that have come to dominate science fiction in the 20th century. In all such dystopia, as in the real world, it is the politically as well as geographically dominant group that controls and regulates the social spaces. As it was evident in the description of Hell's Gate, In James Cameron's movie Avatar, space imageries can be a very powerful indicator of signifying this domination and exercise of power. Such domination and control often takes the form of extensive surveillance, total or partial abolition of private space, and restriction of entry to select spaces, as seen in George Orwell's classic authoritarian dystopia 1984. The story of the novel is in Airstrip 1, a province of the absolute totalitarian state. In Oceania, every individual has to live under the perpetual gaze of the state, both literally and symbolically. Control over space is a prominent aspect of all authoritarian regimes, whether fictional or real, as observable in other sci-fi novels such as Margaret Atwood's feminist dystopia, The Handmaid's Tale, where the women are assigned various intricate roles and spaces by a patriarchal theocracy mainly based on their fertility. Another aspect of such spatial control is reflected in the image of architectures and cityscapes. In contemporary science fiction, such imagery is homogeneous spaces can be different forms, such as in the film The Matrix, where human beings are harvested by machine as energy source. In this future world, human beings are kept in tube-shaped pods filled with red gelatin, all connected to a center core, each capsule like a red, dimly glowing petal attached to a black metal stem. When Neo, the protagonist of the movie, wakes up in his pod from the stimulated reality induced by this machine, he finds himself faced with a most spectacular image. Above him, level after level, the stem rises, seemingly forever. Tower of glowing petals spiral up to incomprehensible heights, disappearing down into a dim murk like an underwater abysses. Such geographical homogeneity is often a direct result of and symptomatic of an obsolete and totalitarian control, and therefore escape from such an oppressive system often entails escaping from that control space, as in The Matrix, where the rebel group trying to overthrow the mechanical regime live in the underground city of Zion, or requires finding a blind spot in that territory like Winston Smith. Another very prominent characteristic of many dystopia is the widespread corporatization and hyper-consumerization of day-to-day existence, which is evident in the omnipresence of various advertisements in the public spaces. Whereas one of the defining features of socialist utopias, as in Ecotopia and Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, has been the conspicuous absence of any commercial signs of billboards. Many dystopia spaces are heavily dominated by such advertisements. This is particularly true of corporate dystopias, where the economy and often even the government are run by big multinational corporations. Frederick Pohl and Cyril K. Cornbill 1953 novel The Space Merchants is a good example of such a dystopia where consumerism and advertising has become the new religion. Despite their apparent polarity, great works of utopia and dystopia science fiction share the similar goal of highlighting the deficiencies of the contemporary world, the former by contrasting the present with a hypothetically better future, and the latter by logically amplifying an inherent shortcomings of the present. In this respect, both these types of the fiction are anchored in the contemporary reality of the author and the reader and serves as a critic of the same. Space imageries play a very crucial role in this critique, as they reflect the material side of the society depicted by science fiction. We can see how, like the real world materiality, every world of science fiction is divided into various spheres, whether it is the world, art, and off-world division of the Blade Runner, where the bioengineered androids called replicants, who are used in hazardous jobs, are legally debarred from entering the art of the upper world, lower world division of the time machine. Understanding the spatial arrangement of a fictional universe can also help understanding its various ideologies as well as the ideologies of the author's time and society, as ideologies are nothing but abstractions of material relations. It is in this respect that space imageries play a very significant political as well as narrative role in science fiction as well. Rather than providing an inert or exotic background to a story that is spatially and or temporally distant from the author and reader, the space imageries in science fiction actively contribute to the overall political and ideological structure and the story. With this, I am concluding this module. Thank you.